The rain beat relentlessly against the windshield as Emma drove down the desolate highway, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. It was supposed to be a simple road trip back to visit her parents, but the storm had thrown a wrench into her plans. The thick fog made it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, and her GPS had died an hour ago, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. Her stomach growled, reminding her it had been hours since she last ate. Just as she was about to pull over and check her phone for directions, a flickering neon sign caught her eye through the mist. Phil's Diner, open 24 hours. Relief washed over her. A warm meal, some coffee, and a chance to get her bearings. That's all she needed. She pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching over the stones. The diner stood alone, a squat, rectangular building with dirty windows and peeling paint. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting an eerie red glow over the entrance. Stepping inside, Emma was greeted by the familiar smell of stale grease and something else, something she couldn't quite place. A metallic scent that lingered in the air. The diner was practically empty, save for a lone waitress behind the counter and a man in a trench coat sitting in the farthest booth, his face obscured by the shadows. "Just sit anywhere, honey," the waitress called out without looking up from the coffee pot she was filling. Emma chose a booth near the window, but she immediately regretted it. The fog had thickened outside, pressing against the glass like a living thing. She felt as though she were trapped in a snow globe, sealed off from the rest of the world. The waitress shuffled over, her apron stained and worn. Her name tag read Dolores. "Menu?" Dolores rasped, her eyes hollow, dark bags under them. Emma nodded, but Dolores didn't hand her one. Instead, she just stared for a moment as if waiting for Emma to speak. Coffee and a burger, please," Emma said, uneasy under the woman's gaze. "Coming right up," Dolores muttered, before shuffling back behind the counter. As Emma waited, she glanced around the diner. The man in the trench coat still hadn't moved. The dim light above him flickered, but his face remained in shadow. Emma felt a chill crawl up her spine. She tried to shake off the discomfort. It was just an old, rundown diner in the middle of nowhere. Nothing sinister about it. But then she noticed something strange. The jukebox in the corner was playing music, but she hadn't seen anyone touch it. The tune was old, something from the 1950s, a lilting, melancholy melody that didn't quite fit the atmosphere. As the song played, the fog outside the window thickened, almost as if it were alive, curling and pressing against the glass in slow, sinuous movements. Her thoughts were interrupted when Dolores returned, slamming the coffee cup and burger on the table. The coffee splashed over the rim, but Dolores didn't seem to notice. She gave Emma a strange look, then shuffled away without a word. Emma stared down at the burger, her appetite fading. It looked undercooked, the patty barely seared, with juice pooling around the edges of the plate. A peculiar odor wafted up from it, something sweet but cloying, and that metallic scent was back, stronger this time. She pushed the plate aside, deciding to focus on her coffee instead. Lifting the cup to her lips, she froze. There, floating in the dark liquid, was a single human tooth. Emma gagged, dropping the cup. The coffee spilled across the table, dark liquid seeping into the cracks of the faded linoleum. Her heart raced as she looked around, but Dolores was nowhere to be seen. The man in the trench coat still hadn't moved, though she could feel his eyes on her now, hidden beneath the brim of his hat. She needed to leave. Now. Emma slid out of the booth and made her way to the door, but something was wrong. The fog outside had thickened to the point where she couldn't see the parking lot anymore, couldn't even see her car. It was like the world outside the diner had disappeared, swallowed up by the mist. She hesitated for just a moment, but it was long enough. A low, grinding noise filled the diner. It was coming from the kitchen. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she slowly turned toward the swinging doors at the back. The noise grew louder, a wet, rhythmic crunching like someone tearing through raw meat. She took a step back, her eyes fixed on the doors, and they swung open with a soft creak. Dolores stood there, her apron drenched in red, her hands gloved in blood up to her elbows. Her eyes were wide, almost feverish, as she stared at Emma. "You should have eaten the burger," she whispered, her voice trembling with something close to madness. Emma's stomach lurched, and she backed toward the door, her hand fumbling for the handle. But the door wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic clawed at her chest as Dolores took a step closer, her bloodied hands reaching out. Just then, a sound echoed from the far end of the diner. The man in the trench coat rose from his booth, and for the first time, Emma could see his face, or rather, the absence of one. His features were a blank slate, smooth and featureless like a mannequin's. He moved toward her in long, slow strides, and Emma's scream caught in her throat, her back pressed against the door, her hands trembling as she pounded on it, but it was no use. The diner had her now. The fog outside pressed harder against the windows, tendrils of it leaking inside through the cracks in the glass. It coiled around her feet, cold and damp, snaking up her legs as Dolores and the faceless man advanced. "You're not the first," Dolores hissed, her voice a raspy whisper. "And you won't be the last." Emma's heart pounded in her chest, her vision blurring as the fog swallowed her whole. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the flickering neon sign outside, buzzing and crackling. Phil's Diner, open 24 hours, but no one ever leaves. The wind howled through the night as Jacob drove along the empty stretch of road, his GPS recalculating for what seemed like the 10th time. He was lost, deep in the back roads of a town he didn't know, and the oppressive darkness weighed on him. His phone's battery was dangerously low, and the gnawing hunger in his stomach was impossible to ignore. That's when he saw it. An old-fashioned diner, its neon sign flickering dimly in the distance. Millie's Diner, it read, and beneath it, in faded letters, since 1954. The place looked like it had seen better days, but it was the only sign of life for miles. Jacob pulled into the empty gravel lot, his headlights casting long shadows across the diner's worn exterior. Something about the place felt off. There were no cars, no lights inside, just that half-dead neon sign buzzing above the door. Hunger won out over his unease. He stepped out of the car, the cold wind biting at his face, and made his way to the entrance. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. It looked like a relic from the past. Red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and a long counter lined with chrome stools. But it was empty. Deathly empty. Jacob paused, considering leaving. But then he saw her. Behind the counter stood a woman, maybe in her mid-40s, with tired eyes and a forced smile. Her name tag read Millie. "Evening," she said, her voice low and raspy. "Take a seat. I'll be with you in a minute." Jacob sat at one of the booths, his eyes scanning the place. It smelled of old grease and something else he couldn't quite place, a faint, rotting odor that made the back of his throat itch. He looked around for any other patrons, but there was no one. Not a single soul. Millie shuffled over with a stained menu, her eyes never quite meeting his. "What'll it be?" "Just coffee and maybe a sandwich," Jacob muttered, feeling a wave of discomfort wash over him. Something was wrong here. Millie gave a slow nod, scribbling down his order before disappearing into the back. As Jacob waited, he noticed something strange. The diner was cold, unnaturally so, as if the heat had been off for years. The fluorescent lights above flickered erratically, casting long shadows that seemed to dance across the walls. And then he saw the photos. Lining the wall behind the counter were dozens of black and white photographs, all taken in the same spot, inside this very diner. The customers in the photos were dressed in clothes from different decades, some in 1950s garb, others from the 70s, 80s, and beyond. They all had one thing in common. None of them were smiling. Their expressions were blank, eyes hollow, almost as if they weren't really alive. Jacob's pulse quickened as he leaned forward, studying the pictures. One photo in particular caught his eye, a man in a suit sitting in the very booth he was in now. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and though the picture was old, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with it. Suddenly, the kitchen door creaked open, and Millie reappeared with his food. She set the plate down in front of him, the coffee sloshing in the cup as her hand trembled slightly. "Here you go," she muttered before turning and walking away, not waiting for a thank you. Jacob stared at the plate. The sandwich looked old, the bread dry and curling at the edges. He lifted the top slice to find something blackened and charred inside. Definitely not the ham and cheese he'd ordered. The unsettling smell hit him again, stronger this time. It wasn't just the sandwich. It was the diner itself. That rotting odor clung to everything, thick and oppressive. Jacob pushed the plate away, his stomach twisting in knots. He glanced back at the photographs, but this time something was different. The photo of the man in the suit, the man was now smiling. A cold, lifeless smile that hadn't been there before. Jacob's heart skipped a beat. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the smile remained. He quickly scanned the other photos, and his blood ran cold. Every single person in every photograph was smiling now, their blank, lifeless expressions twisted into grotesque grins. Panic welled up inside him as he pushed back from the booth. He needed to leave. Now. His eyes darted to the front door, but before he could make a move, a low, dragging sound echoed through the diner. He turned his head slowly toward the kitchen. A shadow moved behind the swinging doors, something large and hulking dragging itself across the floor. The door creaked open just an inch, and Jacob saw it. A pale, emaciated hand gripping the doorframe, its skin stretched tight over bone, fingers twisted and deformed. A soft, wet breathing followed, slow and labored. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. His body screamed at him to run, but he was frozen, unable to tear his eyes away from the door. The hand slid farther into view, revealing a figure so grotesque it was barely human. Its skin was mottled and decayed, patches of hair clinging to its scalp. It crawled forward on all fours, its body too thin, too broken. Then it spoke, its voice a rasping whisper. "Stay a while, we've been waiting for you." Jacob bolted for the door, his heart pounding in his chest, his feet slipping on the greasy floor. He yanked the door open and stumbled into the cold night air, the wind biting at his skin. He didn't stop to look back as he scrambled to his car, fumbling for his keys. The engine roared to life, and Jacob sped away, his tires kicking up gravel. He glanced in the rearview mirror, and his blood turned to ice. In the diner's window, standing perfectly still, was Millie. But she wasn't alone. Behind her, the faceless customers from the photos stood in a line, all of them smiling that same lifeless smile. And as Jacob drove away, the neon sign above the diner flickered one last time before going dark. Millie's Diner, since 1954. But no one had left that diner in decades, and deep down, Jacob knew they never would. The highway stretched endlessly before Cassie, a dark ribbon cutting through miles of barren fields. It had been a long drive, and her eyelids felt heavier with every passing minute. She checked the clock on the dashboard, 1:37 a.m. She hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour. The only thing keeping her company was the static-filled hum of the radio and the rhythmic thrum of her tires against the asphalt. Her stomach growled loudly, reminding her she hadn't eaten since lunchtime. She scanned the horizon for any sign of life. It was then that she spotted a glow in the distance, a faint but unmistakable neon sign flashing the word, "Diner." Relief washed over her. Finally, a break from the loneliness of the road and a chance to grab something to eat. Cassie pulled off the highway and onto the gravel road that led to the diner. The place looked old, like it had been there forever, weathered by time but still standing. The sign flickered weakly above the building, the neon buzzing as it struggled to stay lit. She parked in the empty lot and stepped out of her car, the cool night air hitting her like a wave. The building itself was small, only a few windows, and the paint on the walls had long since chipped away. But there was a warm light spilling from the windows, and through the glass she could see a few booths and stools at the counter. Cassie pushed open the door, and the bell above it gave a soft jingle. Inside, the diner was almost too quiet, the kind of stillness that made her feel like she was walking into a forgotten room. A single man sat in a corner booth, his back turned to her. Behind the counter, a woman, probably in her late 50s, wiped down the bar with slow, deliberate motions. "Sit wherever you like, Han," the waitress called without looking up. Cassie took a seat at a booth by the window, Stinton's, her back to the door. The waitress shuffled over, her white apron stained, and handed her a menu. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice raspy and hollow. Yes, please," Cassie nodded, feeling a strange sense of unease. The waitress's eyes were dull, almost vacant, as if she were seeing through her. Cassie glanced at the menu. It was basic: burgers, fries, milkshakes. But it all felt wrong, like the words were from a different time. No prices, no descriptions, just names of food. Her hunger gnawed at her, though, and she ordered a cheeseburger and fries. The waitress jotted it down, shuffling back to the kitchen. As Cassie waited, she felt the heavy silence settle around her again. The man in the corner hadn't moved since she arrived. His plate sat untouched in front of him, and though his face was turned away, something about him seemed off. She took a sip of her coffee. It was bitter, more like sludge than coffee, and tasted like it had been sitting there for hours. Cassie grimaced, but forced another sip, trying to shake the unease creeping up her spine. The diner's lights flickered just for a second, and in that brief flash, she thought she saw something strange in the reflection of the window. The man in the corner had his head turned toward her. But when she glanced back, he hadn't moved. Her heart skipped a beat. She tried to laugh it off. It was late, and her mind was playing tricks on her. That's all. Minutes passed, but the tension in the air grew thicker. The kitchen door swung open, and the waitress returned, setting down the plate of food in front of her without a word. The burger looked greasy, the fries limp and soggy. Cassie's stomach churned, but she took a bite anyway, forcing herself to eat. That's when she heard it, a faint, whispering sound. At first, she thought it was the wind outside, but then it came again, clearer this time. It was coming from the man in the corner. His head was still turned away, but now she could hear him whispering, low and frantic, like he was speaking to someone or something right there with him. Cassie froze, her breath catching in her throat. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a strange, eerie cadence. She could make out words now, though they didn't make sense. They never leave. They watch, always watching. Hungry. Her eyes darted to the waitress, but the woman was staring straight ahead, her eyes glazed over, as if she hadn't heard a thing. Cassie's hands trembled as she pushed her plate away. She needed to get out of here. She stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the floor. The whispering stopped. The man in the corner suddenly turned his head, and Cassie's blood ran cold. His face was pale, impossibly pale, like he hadn't seen sunlight in years. His eyes were sunken, dark hollows where his gaze should have been. His lips curled into a slow, grotesque grin. "Leaving so soon?" he rasped, his voice a low growl that didn't match the whispers. Cassie's pulse raced. She backed away toward the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The lights flickered again, but this time, they didn't come back on. The diner was plunged into darkness, save for the dim glow of the neon sign outside. She could hear movement behind her, the scrape of a chair, the shuffling of feet. The man was getting up. Cassie fumbled for the door handle, her hands slick with sweat. She yanked it open and stumbled outside into the freezing night. The gravel crunched beneath her feet as she sprinted to her car, not daring to look back. She jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door and locking it. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the keys, trying to start the engine. The diner loomed behind her, dark and silent now, but she could feel eyes watching her from within. Finally, the engine roared to life. She floored the gas pedal, speeding away, the diner's eerie glow fading into the distance behind her. Cassie didn't stop until she reached the next town, miles away, her mind racing with what had just happened. The next day, she told the locals about the diner, about the man, the waitress, the whispers. They exchanged uneasy glances, one of them shaking his head. "Millie's diner?" One of them asked slowly. "That place burned down 30 years ago. It's just an empty lot now." Cassie's heart stopped. She had seen it. She had been inside it. But when she drove back to the spot the next day, there was nothing there. Just a patch of dead, overgrown land where the diner should have been. The only thing left was a charred, rusted neon sign lying in the grass, barely legible, but unmistakable. Millie's Diner, open 24 hours. But it was long gone.